In a world where entertainment is viewed as mindless diversion, only good for momentary distraction, one podcast has taken a stand, thoughtfully engaging the art of our day, dissecting the narrative, and pointing the people back to the greatest storyteller of all. You are about to enter a new world, and you will never view entertainment in the same way again. This is Popcorn Theology.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be
Hello,
mine?
neighbor. Have you ever been to the movies? I love movies. To go to the land of make-believe through moving pictures? Sometimes, if we really pay attention to movies, we can see the very special place God has for us in His great story. They can help us to be brave, to admit our mistakes, and to love one another. Movies can help us enter another world. Let's see who's at the door. Oh, it's my good friend David.
Hello, Miles.
Hello, David. And who have you brought with you today?
Well, this is Becky, the friendliest neighbor in the Popcorn Theology neighborhood. Say hello, Becky.
Hello.
Hello, Becky. What have you brought for us today?
Well, this is episode 274 of Popcorn Theology.
Oh, welcome,
oh, that's
everyone.
wonderful.
We're not going to do the whole episode like that?
It's genuinely hard to channel Mr. Rogers. He's so kind and genuine. It's like I have to think about it real hard just to be a little bit like Mr. Rogers for a few moments.
Well, you did very well.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that perspective.
Thank you for that perspective.
That was a lot of fun.
Maybe it's I guess that's one of the themes of the movies is how much it appears effortless that he was so kind and genuine with people and genuinely interested in what they had to say. But then, this is spoiler alert. I don't know if people care about that for a Mr. Rogers movie. One of my favorite points that we will get to later is how much work he put into being somebody who's genuinely interested in other people.
Yeah, I was appreciative that they addressed that, because otherwise he's just kind of intimidatingly good, like almost infuriatingly good.
Yeah, like just before the episode, you were talking about the dad in Bluey, right?
Yeah, Bluey. Yeah, Bandit. Yeah, he's. It was funny because it wasn't meant to be a dovetailing into this episode, but it actually was pretty close. That people online have been kind of critical of Bluey. And I can relate to being critical of, not Bluey, Bluey's dad, Bandit, as being either a bad father or too good a father. There must be something wrong with him. I'm at the point where I'm like, I don't like how much Bandit shines a light on my poor parenting. But Mr. Rogers, I think, could perhaps be seen in a similar way. But he's just so kind that it's hard to hold that against him in any way. So I'm curious with this movie. So, by the way, we're going to try and talk spoiler-free about the plot of the film. But obviously, there's not much plot to spoil about the show. And so in terms of Mr. Rogers, is this a show that you guys grew up on? Is this a major part of your upbringing or something that you came into later? What's your story with Mr. Rogers?
Yeah, for me, I didn't watch Mr. Rogers too often as a kid. It was just kind of always on, and I'd hop in and out. It was kind of a strange little, almost a time capsule experience. He was on when I was a child, like in his last few seasons. But I didn't watch him regularly at all. He was just kind of like this kind figure that was just around in life.
He was always there when you needed him, but you may not go to him all the time. What about you, Becky?
Yeah, I watched it. I can't recall about how much frequency in comparison to other things, but it's definitely kind of like a feature of my childhood, probably.
But perhaps if I was on a subway and a bunch of people started singing the song, I might be able to join in.
Yeah.
You like that? I think that scene was in the trailer, right? Where everybody from all walks of life. That is the thing. Mr. Rogers seemed to have an effect on basically everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, everyone definitely knows that. I know, like, people always talk about, like, you know, you have one and or two of the pillars of, like, what you watched as a kid. It would be this or Sesame Street. Definitely I saw Mr. Rogers more than I've seen Sesame Street.
Yeah. That's a good way to put those, is that they're kind of in the cultural consciousness, but it's not like anybody has binged Sesame Street. You know what I mean? Like it's maybe not the kind of show that necessarily got watched every day, but it was always there. Kind of like the Today Show or something like that. It's around, or even for adults, like late night shows like Jay Leno. You may not watch it on a regular basis, but you know who he is if you're of a certain age. At least
know what it's like for people like today, because I'm like, it also comes from a time where, you know, pre-streaming and pre-cable, where it's like, you know, you turn it on and like what's on.
Yeah.
And Mr. Rogers might be on at that time, you know, might be other things, but you wouldn't. Where nowadays, if you want to go and watch it, like maybe you can find it and you go watch episode 1, 2, 3, 4, you know, like.
Yeah, I've recently discovered it on Internet Archive, which has been a great resource. Ever since our episode on Harvey, I've started looking for movies that have any age to them on Internet Archive, and I've been watching them a little bit with my 2-year-old son, and I've seen some problems with a lot of the kids programs. Childhood experts will be like, some of the kids programs that are produced today are so flashy, and they change the angles so often. It's like crack for your kids' eyes, where it's just continual stimulation. In contrast, you see Mr. Rogers is this slow, steady pace, speaking right to a child, trying to get a hold of their to connect with their emotions a little more than their attention span and their. I find that an interesting contrast to a lot of the shows. If you watch a lot of kids shows today, it's just cut after cut after cut after cut after cut, keeping the kids' attention with a new shot. But Mr. Rogers were these long, slow, methodical descriptions of things for children, and that seems like a big contrast than a lot of kid shows today.
That's a good
adult
point.
shows as well too. When you think about YouTube, you know, everybody always got to go to get it really quick, and you have to do this talking, or people are going to turn away from your channel in like 5 seconds, or you know, you always have to have like explosions and different things, and
sometimes they'll even cut out the breath marks. Like, you know, one of the channels I follow, SciShow, like he'll be talking at an impossibly fast rate, not so much because he's talking fast, but because at the points where one would stop and breathe and like take a moment and take a thought, it is clipped to another shot, and so it's all pieced together like that, which makes for a really effective, like, you know, quick delivery. But yeah, it's this is much better. I think you're right, Miles. Something that is better processed by kids.
It feels almost like whole grains for your eyes, like and like a lot of the shows for kids can be like sugary cereal. I don't know about you guys, but I also see Mr. Rogers pop up in the cultural mind sometimes around heavy moments. He gave one monologue in his show about, I think it was in reference to some terrorist attack, where it's this kind of famous clip of him saying, "Look for the helpers," and that's always kind of an encouraging thing. And I can't even remember the last time I saw it, but every once in a while it gets posted up when there's something just kind of dominating the news feed in a negative way,
like a hurricane or something. Yeah,
I think I remember it going around a lot at the beginning of 2020 because everyone was incredibly confused and scared, and like. And then, you know, and of course right away different like politics and different things came into it, but you know, something that everybody needed, you know, so that was kind of going around and, you know, trying to give like that encouragement. And so I remember people keep like reposting that because it's just like, I don't know what 2020 is, but like, you know, look for the helpers. And
yeah. And
For sure.
Mr. Rogers was just so pure. He cuts across political boundaries. There's also, at one point late in his career, he was honored with the Daytime Emmy Lifetime Achievement Award. And he had this moment where, so instead of thanking a huge list of people, he just told everybody to consider, he's like, I'm going to pause for 10 seconds, of live TV, just to have everyone in this room think of the special people who have loved us into being. That thing that he had all of these actors and actresses from all these different shows, like crime dramas and action,
soap operas, daytime stuff. Yeah.
Are tearing up, and they just had this great admiration for a man who is just really kind and genuine. And I think that whoever wrote this movie incorporated that moment into a few pieces of this film. I have so much admiration for Mr. Rogers. I'd like to adopt his way of being, as it's said at one point in the movie.
Yeah.
And speaking of this movie, did you guys notice the way it was filmed? It was kind of like a big episode of Mr. Rogers. Do you guys notice that?
Yeah, I loved the setting.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
Go ahead, Becky. Sorry, I didn't mean to step on you there.
Oh,
I'm trying.
No, sorry. Yeah, I had forgot that it did that when I was watching it again. I was just like, oh wow, this is so good.
Yeah.
Yeah, because overall, this movie, just because like popcorn level, it just made me love Mr. Rogers again. Made me love just also the filmmaking, because I'm like, this is so good how they have it structured like this.
Yeah, I love the transition that they used to go from Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, which is presumably in Pittsburgh, a real neighborhood. I don't know if it's actually based on one, but whatever. And then it pans over and it keeps going. And I'm like, what are they doing? There's no way the set goes that far. And then they keep going. And then eventually you see the Twin Towers and you're like, oh, I see what they're doing. This is cool. And then part of me was like, this is really neat filming. And then I also thought, what a brilliant way to save money on all the outdoor shots. Like instead of doing cutaways, like you actually just go to like, oh, and we're in New York now. Oh, we're over here now. Like I thought, wow, you could almost film all of the rest of it in sets rather than having to go on location. But they didn't chintz on that either, because they do go on location for several scenes. So I was like, wow, this is actually like, you can tell it wasn't just a choice made to save money. It was very intentional. And the overall framing of it with Lloyd, who, I always like to talk a little about casting when we can before the ad break. And like, to me, I'll be honest, and I'll get this out of the way now. There's something about this movie I was a bit salty about, which is Tom Hanks. I love Tom Hanks. He's a fantastic actor, but to me, he's Tom Hanks. So it's like, he's such an iconic character that sometimes I struggle with separating him from the character he's playing. And he doesn't look tremendously like Mr. Rogers, but then again, no one does. So at first I was like, okay, all right, let's see him do this. And I don't know. He's been cast as so many other characters now that I'm just like, I get a little frustrated when I see Tom Hanks, mostly because I'm just like, let someone else have a turn, buddy. Come on. Like, really? Do you need it?
Yeah, if you are a popcorn theologian and you're wondering why we haven't covered this movie earlier, I'm blaming David, because it's basically that. Because every time he's like, I just can't do another Tom Hanks movie.
But no, I mean, we can say it's that. We can also just say in general, it's that you guys finally wore us down on it.
Yeah.
Because it's been a while. You guys have been pushing for us to do Mr. Rogers, Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. The other thing is and I will say that despite being salty about that, like 30 seconds into the movie, it was gone. The sense that that's Tom Hanks, that's not Fred Rogers, was gone. I fell completely into, okay, he's doing the character very well. And so, yeah, I was like, and so even told my wife, I was like, okay, this was good. This was, I'll say I was wrong. And so I was definitely wrong on thinking that would be a hindrance to the story. But for the first like 2 minutes, I'm just like, So.
No, see, I was skeptical at first when I remember first hearing about it. But I was just like, also just with other things, I can't really think of stuff that, I'm like, okay, I'll trust this casting people that they know what they're doing. Because I remember seeing some like TV documentaries a while back, and I remember it was for I Love Lucy and or Shirley Temple, and I'm thinking like, you can find someone that looks more like them, but they capture the person so well. So it's like, well, yeah, okay, this is you can maybe the people who look exactly like them don't do it as well. And so I'm like, I'll hold out hope. And then sure enough, I'm like, okay, this is crazy how he doesn't look like him, and yet you get sucked in and this is him. Like,
Yeah.
But yeah, so listen to that, Lori. If you were pushing for Elvis and they haven't done it, it's David's fault.
Yeah, we'll blame.
I did have an
because
issue
of
with
Tom
that part of
Hanks.
And
Yeah, no, she's-
Ask Austin Butler. I look at him and I'm like, that ain't Elvis. I'm like, it's hard when you're so iconic and distinct looking. It's like if they ever did like a Steve Buscemi biopic, which I don't know why you would, but if they did, it's like there's no one, you'll never find someone who looks like that guy ever. Like, you just have to give up. And so it's got to be someone who can act like him.
One of the biopic kind of shows that's been produced recently is on Amazon. I forget what it's called. The I Love Lucy one, where Nicole Kidman is Lucy and Javier Bardem is he's not Ricky Ricardo's
Ricky.
what he plays. What's his
Desi Arnaz.
Desi Arnaz. Yeah. That is.
I think it might be Meet the Ricardos or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Meet the Ricardos. Yeah, it was a recent one. So that's the one.
Yeah.
And that's one where I look at the picture and I'm just like, nope. Like, especially Javier Bardem. I'm like, he's got too intense a face to play Desi Arnaz, in my opinion, in my humble opinion. But like, I don't know who would be better. I don't know. Like,
yeah. But the interesting thing about a lot of those shows is typically a biopic is really about the person who played the character that we all love. But this movie, it wasn't really obvious who the main character was, because the title of the movie, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, kind of represents, it doesn't take place over a single day, but the way the whole movie operates is like an episode of A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, where a guest comes into Mr. Rogers' world and is changed by Mr. Rogers' worldview. It's a really really interesting. Like, I didn't expect it watching the movie. I thought I was going to get, Fred Rogers as a kid, Fred Rogers as a teen, Fred Rogers as an adult. But really, it's like somebody, let's enter into the world and kind of answer the question of, can this children's TV show really live up to the challenge of real world problems?
Yeah, I mean, and in that sense, it's almost not his story so much as it is Lloyd Vogel's story, that he's the one who we're tracking his interaction with. He has this encounter with Fred Rogers, and he's changed by it, like you said. And so therefore the framing of it, and honestly, if it started out with the scene focused on Lloyd, that would have been fitting. I mean, I like what they did, but I'm just saying, like, because of the overall framing really being his story, I think that's kind of where I'm at with it. I don't know. Thoughts, Becky?
Yeah. I think though that kind of is like, by having it focus on someone else, that still goes back and talks about who Mr. Rogers is, right? Because he's just focusing on other people, like. So the fact that Mr. Rogers' movie is like pretty much about someone else points back to that feature about him, where it's just because, I think about that time where he was like, what's the most important thing right now? He's like, talking to Lloyd Vogel. I'm just like,
oh yeah.
So yeah.
That's a really good point. I mean, and that he takes pictures. I love that he takes pictures of the people that he meets, and he's not in the picture with them. It's not about him. I'm just like, this is crazy. I knew none of this stuff about him. I barely watched the show. I've maybe watched 2 or 3 episodes of Mr. Rogers in my life. I knew the song, and usually I wouldn't get far past the song before I'd change the channel to Spider-Man or some other thing. And it was just not something that was part of my upbringing, really. And so this was interesting to me, because I didn't know that much about him, and assuming that, this movie's fairly accurate, which I'm guessing it would be. I'm also curious if his widow was if she's still alive, if she was consenting in like their use of his character. I don't know. I would be fascinated to know, but regardless, I'm sure whoever is in charge of the estate, had to sign off on it, which is going to be an element of why it was made when it was made. So I don't know. To me, this is really interesting. I thought it was odd also that they changed the characters, the name of the journalist, right? It wasn't, at the end they mentioned this is based on an article by somebody else, and then I guess they changed his name to Lloyd Vogel.
Yeah. Yeah, so apparently this was semi-based on a true story by a journalist named Tom Junod, Junod.
Junod, I don't know. Yeah.
Sorry, Tom. But maybe they just wanted him to to address different problems. I hadn't read the article or the book, and so it's at least enough to say that this is something that could have happened, and that idea of that Mr. Rogers can have such an impact on a kind of skeptical person is a very true to life story. So it's a strange thing because we're gonna do film and theology on this movie, but it's because we're talking about a real person. It's a bit different. It makes some of these points hit a bit different because we're kind of talking about a real person that's kind of hard to believe that they are real.
And it's interesting too that they chose not to reveal the article to us, because if I'm remembering right, we don't hear an over, like, usually it would be, zoom out, show guy typing on computer, and you hear in his voice, I was changed by my experiences with Fred, and then we would kind of get at least a taste of what the article was. Instead, we see people reading it and reacting to it, but we don't really get him. We don't actually get to know what's in the article. Am I? Yeah. I might be misremembering on that point, but
yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, that is something that would normally be there, but they didn't.
They're like, it's totally you. What is totally you, Lloyd Vogel?
Yeah.
We probably can go along with the thing of like, besides that not being the main focus, it's also a show and not tell thing because it's just like, well, we just watched it, so
right.
Yep.
That's
and
true. There's some tricky trippy elements to the movie as well, I should say. I thought that all the scenes where he was like kind of hallucinating things were weird, and I was not expecting that. That was neat. And I will say I didn't want to leave out the other main character, or perhaps the main character, Lloyd Vogel, played by Matthew Rhys. I had not seen him in anything before. Apparently he was in The Americans and a bunch of other stuff. I had never seen him before, but man, as soon as I saw his face, I was like, oh my gosh, it's John Ritter. Like, that is John Ritter. And it's actually not just John Ritter. It's, if you had you guys remember Animorphs, how like the picture cover of the book would have like a one thing turning into another thing, like a bird turning into a person.
Yeah.
It's in Scrubs, jumping back to our Scrubs episode, the casting was amazing of having John Ritter play Zach Braff's dad, because they looked a lot alike. And to me, I'm like, if you had like an Animorphs thing between Zach Braff, who played JD, and John Ritter, who played his dad, halfway between the two would be Matthew Rhys, perfectly intermediate between the two. And I was just like, he should have been like the long lost brother from Scrubs. Anyway, so I was just struck by that face.
A great kind of, just the shot of his face, just kind of, anytime he was surprised, he also had sadness in his face in almost every scene. In whatever he was doing, it was like determination and a little sadness, skepticism and a little sadness. It was very evocative. Like, it just, it's like he's presented just as this challenge to Mr. Rogers' world. In such a great, like Becky was saying, a show don't tell kind of way.
A lot of Christian films can learn from this, because that's the main problem. Well, one of the main problems with a lot of Christian films is not that they have a bad message, or not always that they have terrible acting. It's that they try to telegraph everything in it. And sometimes we just need to be shown something. We don't need to actually have it spelled out and laid out for us. Anyway, yeah, I thought the casting was fantastic. And even just the way, like you said, his use of his face, Matthew Rhys was excellent in that. And honestly, it was very similar to the John Ritter thing, where John Ritter and Zach Braff, for that matter, were fantastic at making that leap. Scrubs was best known for like almost the whiplash you would get from a lighthearted, happy moment to a really intense, dramatic moment. And to have an actor who can swing both of those extremes is special. And I think that he did a great job, even though, of course, he's going to be overshadowed by Mr. Rogers in this story. So anyway, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to that, because that blew me away, because he had some intense stuff to portray in this film. So fantastic casting.
Yeah, that was a fantastic casting. Good craft of a movie, good craft of a story, good storytelling. But now let's pull everybody into the film and theology style. That's where we're going to start transitioning in here. And if you would like to be pulled into our neighborhood where you are not mindless consumers, we'll remind you that for just $1 a month, you could become one of our patron saints. You can join us on any of our social media channels. We even have some of our patron saints right now in our live recording, watching with us, commenting with us. My mom's in here. Hi, Mom. And your mom can join too if she wants to be a patron saint. It'd be great.
If you want your mom or dad to join, they just have to pay $1.
Yeah,
That's right. It's just like your milk money, right? Yeah, or if you're, as long as you don't get into a fist fight with your dad in the group, then your dad can join too. That's fine. So
and starting this week, I think maybe a week before, Becky has been working pretty hard on our YouTube channel. She's been starting to slowly upload some of our back episodes, and so now we are branching out in 2022. We're finally getting on the YouTube, so we're ahead of the curve here.
Apparently, it's a phase.
This is
It's not just a phase that's going away. YouTube is here to stay.
Yeah, we thought it would just
turns out.
Yeah, it seems like it's here to stay. But Popcorn Theology is there. We've been throwing up short videos here and there now. But if you want to catch some of our episodes, you can find us there on YouTube.
For sure. Yeah, thank you. And I guess we didn't really properly introduce Becky earlier. That this is the first time on an episode, but Becky's been behind the scenes for quite some time on the social media side of things, basically making things run the way that she has. And so she's done a fantastic job, and really appreciate all her hard work. And now she finally gets to be in front of the mic, I guess you could say, or behind the mic. I don't know the
Behind? Yeah.
Behind the mic. In front of you, behind the mic.
The mic in front of, instead of behind the keyboard.
In front of the camera. I mean, because there's a camera involved. We do the video recording for the Discord. So like Miles mentioned,
Miles's mom and Dave can see it.
Right, exactly. For sure. So consider doing that. Be part of our community. And then also, it's really helpful. Just the little things can be super helpful for us. As Mr. Rogers would like to remind us, that sometimes it's just the little things are so important. So liking and sharing the episode, let people know about us using social media. And so wherever you follow us, just go ahead and hit share it with your friends, have discussions about the movies, consider rating and reviewing us on iTunes or wherever it is that you listen. Because if you listen there, then somebody else will listen there, and your rating and review might convince them to do so. So preferably 5-star review or 5-star ratings, but also just some nice, a few nice words would be appreciated. Sometimes a few kind words just go a long way. But we should probably, this is bad. We're going to go ahead and drop the ads at this point, and then we'll come back to discuss a bit further A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood.
This episode of Popcorn Theology is brought to you by Missionalware. Missionalware has a large selection of high-quality apparel, drinkware, art, and more, all from a Reformed Christian perspective. Check out missionalware.com and tell them Popcorn Theology sent you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Popcorn Theology. If you want to hear more from us, subscribe on iTunes or your favorite podcast catcher.
Also, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and share this episode with your friends.
Assuming you have friends. To sponsor more content like this, consider supporting Popcorn Theology through Patreon. Then you'll make some friends.
For just $1 a month, you can have friends. You can become a patron saint and be added to our exclusive Facebook group, where you can interact, influence, and vote on future episodes of the podcast.
Well, let's get back to the episode.
What do you do with the mad that you feel when you feel so mad you could bite? When the whole wide world seems oh so wrong, and nothing you do seems very right. What do? Do you punch a bag? Do you pound some clay or some
All right, welcome back. We have dropped the spoiler warning, so we can talk all about Lloyd Vogel and what in particular was going on with him. And who it was that hurt him, not just on his face, but inside as well. And so I think that the framing of this is really interesting. And so I'm curious, this whole idea of the Lloyd Vogel episode, if you will, we gradually get introduced to more and more of his story. And at the outset, we just know that he's been hurt by someone, and he's carrying this around, and that's affected the way that he sees the world. And ultimately, his encounters with Mr. Rogers change that for him. But overall, we get the starting point of forgiveness being told to us as kind of the theme of the episode and / movie. And so that was pretty interesting, right? To start out with forgiveness rather than gradually ending up there.
Yeah, it's like the movie cues up like an episode of Mr. Rogers is, do you know what it means to forgive? This is my friend Lloyd Vogel. Somebody really hurt him, not just on the outside, but on the inside. So Mr. Rogers is dealing with emotions, and how do you get to a place of forgiveness? And he gives a definition of forgiveness. He says, it's a decision we make to release a person from the feelings of anger we have at them. And then he's like, and it's strange, sometimes the people who are closest to us are hardest to forgive. It's like all of those points hit so hard. And then like speaking to a child, Mr. Rogers later on in the movie says, have you ever felt the way Lloyd does? So angry that you want to hurt somebody? And it's like, of course, that's everybody in the audience. And encouraging even adults, there's always something you can do with the mad that you feel. All of these things. So it's the movie takes this very realistic thing, somebody embittered toward their father who abandoned them in a time of need, and says, okay, how can Mr. Rogers' mission to help children come up with constructive ways to deal with their feelings lead a skeptical journalist type who's always uncovering the dirt under society, to deal with his feelings and come to a point of forgiveness with his father.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and this really is the kind of movie that makes you want to sit cross-legged on the floor in front of the TV, a little too close to the TV kind of thing. Like even as an adult, he starts with that and you go like, okay, I'm in. I've gotten over the fact that that's Tom Hanks, and now I want to, tell me about forgiveness. I'm not good. Yes, I feel that way. I sometimes want to hurt somebody. Yeah, tell me how to deal with that. So, but you're right. And that definition he has of forgiveness, I think is kind of interesting, because this is sort of the definition that I have grown up with, is the notion that even if the person feels no remorse for their activity or for their wrongdoing, that by forgiving them, we, among other things, we release ourselves from the grudge that we're holding against them. I've actually seen some people react pretty negatively and strongly to that definition of forgiveness. And maybe we don't have to go too far down that road, but I was just curious if you guys have seen something similar where they say, no, it's only forgiveness if the person is remorseful and apologizes and asks for forgiveness. At that point, you can forgive. It's not possible to forgive someone, say, after they've died, or if they show no regret for what they've done. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I think that there was the time that Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He didn't say, Father, forgive them once they realize what they did and apologize.
Yeah. Well, there's
good point.
I think there's a couple ways. I think I might divide the concepts into forgiveness and reconciliation. So forgiveness is something that's only on your side of the table. And that's letting go is a really good word for it. I think it's really close to the Greek for forgiveness, which is just like I'm squeezing my fists together. I'm going to hold on to my anger and my rights because you committed an injustice against me. I am vengeance. There's a part of that. But forgiveness is like releasing that anger, releasing the rights that you have over to somebody. I know C.S. Lewis talked about, like, if somebody steals from you and you forgive them, you absorb their debt. You effectively pay the $100 or whatever they stole from you. But reconciliation involves the two-way street. And but like Dave in our chat talks about, reference Jesus and if your brother comes to you and repents 7 times, 70 times, you forgive him. I think Jesus is talking a little bit more about reconciliation and community life. But the forgiveness that Mr. Rogers, I think, is talking about is more about your feelings, about your internal struggle, where you really can forgive somebody who has died by letting go of the bitterness. I often define forgiveness in my head as a refusal to take revenge. That's not I don't think it's a full. I don't think that's a full definition, but I think it helps me figure out what I'm supposed to not do if I'm trying to forgive somebody, is a refusal to take revenge on somebody, refusal to hold on to it. I think at one point Lloyd's mom says, maybe it's a vision that he has, like you are holding on, because she had died. I know you're trying to like continue to be angry at him because of me, but I don't need that from you. Something like that.
Yeah. That was fascinating. Yeah. I thought that was a really beautiful moment that she's, I don't need that, because ultimately that seemed to be what was really motivating him, was out of honor for her. I can't forgive him because she wouldn't forgive him and he doesn't deserve that. And I need to hold this against him for her sake, because otherwise, what kind of son would I be if I just forgave him? That's why he seemed to have feelings of resentment for his sister, for so easily forgiving their dad, or at least letting him back into her life. I mean, it made a lot of sense that he that we framed it in that vision sense, that the mom was able to allow him to let go, because I think that really is a key part of the bitterness that we hold on to with people is yes, it is for our own sake, but sometimes it is on behalf of someone else. And that's what the case was with Lloyd and his mother. And fortunately, we don't get a situation in this particular story where the father is completely unrepentant, completely unremorseful, or that he dies before Lloyd gets to have that moment. But there are plenty of people in history who are separated from that, from the person that they're forgiving, either by time or by circumstances, and they're not able to get that reconciliation. But they can make amends as far as they can on their own. I agree that the sort of reaction that I've heard against the notion of forgiveness without remorse is, I think, a little too harsh. There is a time and a place for that, for sure.
Yeah, I think it changes the way you react to somebody if somebody has no remorse, because they're still kind of aligned against you as an enemy. But like in our chat was saying, my mom was saying that their response is between them and God. What you are called to is to be in a posture of forgiveness and love toward your enemies, toward your neighbors. Yeah, love toward your neighbors would be a good way to summarize Fred Rogers' mission in life. And what I like about this movie is there's all that background that is under the surface just by looking at Lloyd. And what happens is he comes and he has an experience, like it could be almost easy to say with a Jesus kind of type figure, but really I like to picture it as Mr. Rogers kind of shows us the possibility of what a disciple of Christ, how they can interact with people. And like, can you be, like Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me. If somebody really takes up their cross to try to be an agent of kindness and love to people, and Mr. Rogers invites Lloyd into his life. So the beginning of the movie, Lloyd gets this assignment. We're doing an assignment on heroes, and none of the heroes would let Lloyd interview them except for Fred, except for Mr. Rogers. Like Bill Eisler, who I thought was an interesting character in this, like a man who was described as protective of Fred. He says, "You're here because Fred wants you here. He loves people like you." And Bill Eisler's like, "I insisted that we read everything, and we read everything that we could find." So Mr. Rogers, he's not ignorant of what Lloyd is bringing to the table. And I'm kind of interested. What did you guys think about that character of Bill? He wasn't in too many scenes, or really of any of the producers in the show.
I thought they were interesting because they seemed kind of exasperated with Fred, even though he had been doing this for decades, or at least he had been. Maybe they were new, but they're like, every day he's always meeting with these kids and taking this time, and like, we're trying to keep a schedule and everything like that. But he was interesting because he seemed similarly exasperated, but also was very protective, and somebody who, I mean, it's interesting because he even viewed Mr. Rogers as someone who needed to be protected. That he was seen as someone who would need that. When that's not necessarily the case. He's not dumb. He's not doe-eyed. He kind of appears to be a little simple, a little naive at times. But that was, I think, in part because of the character he was playing. And that was another interesting thing, that they never say it in so many words, but the clear implication is that Lloyd says, well, so it's an act, right? This is your character that happens to share your name, kind of like, the Bill Cosby Show or whatever. You might share a name with a character, but how do you differ from him? And Fred's like, he's confused. That's not really the way that this works. I'm not really playing a character. I'm just being me on TV.
Yeah, that reminds me of this.
Aware of how to deal with that.
Yeah, that exchange reminds me of a dark comedy that came out, I think, in the early 2000s called Death to Smoochie. It stars Robin Williams and Ed Norton. And Robin Williams plays like this terrible person who was a Barney figure in his world. And then he was like carousing, fornicating, smoking, drinking in the background. He's really this kind of despicable person who can play the Barney figure. And then Ed Norton is kind of like a Mr. Rogers figure who's coming onto the scene. And he plays this, and his character is Smoochie. And it's all about this.
That's such a good
completely,
movie.
Yeah. It's a dark comedy. It's rated R if I remember
It's very
correctly.
heavy. I'm not sure we could recommend it, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't even remember when I saw it, but the themes rang in my ears while watching this. Is just that's a movie about how all these really broken, cynical characters interact with Ed Norton's character, who's kind of like a genuine Mr. Rogers type. And like Bill Eisler in this movie wanted to protect Mr. Rogers, and maybe there was a little bit to that, but Fred was not at all intimidated with the hard things in life. He would invite people in. I don't know if you guys hear this phrase a lot in the church, the come and see ministry of Jesus. Like in the beginning of the book of John, John has disciples, James and John, 2 of the 12 disciples, and John's announcing, "Behold the Lamb of God," when Jesus comes, and John points people toward Jesus, and these guys start following Jesus, and Jesus says, come and see where I'm staying. Come and see my life. Come live with me. And that's kind of what Fred reminded me of in this movie is the way Jesus would just, all right, invite, the phrase that's often said in our generation is doing life together, actually getting to know each other. And there's a lot of people who are scared for Fred Rogers, like his wife, Lloyd's wife, Andrea, is just like, oh God, Lloyd, please don't ruin my childhood. Like, please don't reveal that this guy is not who he really says he is, because it's this sweet, sweet moment from my childhood. But Fred says, come and see.
I like you mentioned the come and see thing. It reminds me as well of, I believe it was Nathaniel who was under the fig tree when the Lord saw him, and his brother Andrew, I think, or, oh goodness, I forget. One of the apostles goes to him and says, come, basically tells him about Jesus, this man from Nazareth. And I think Nathaniel is the one who said, can anything good come from Nazareth?
Yeah. Nathaniel's in the tree.
He says, come and see.
Andrew is Peter's brother. Yeah.
Yeah. And then he says, come and see. And so it extends from Jesus saying, come and see, to his disciples discipling others by saying, come and see. And ultimately, the phrase is repeated, if I remember correctly, later when John is in prison and he's losing hope and he's losing faith a bit in Christ for a moment. He says, are you really the one? Are you really the Messiah? And Jesus, he sends John sends his disciples to ask this. And Jesus replies, basically, they've already come and seen. He said, what have you seen? The dead live, the lame walk,
the blind are receiving their sight, the gospel is being proclaimed, all of these things.
And go and tell. Yeah. So come and see, then go and tell.
Yeah. So like Jesus calls his followers to love your neighbor, and Mr. Rogers goes, okay, I will give it a shot. I'm going to announce a beautiful day in the neighborhood and invite anybody to be my neighbor, either through the TV screen and then anybody who comes into the studio. And, whether the producers like it or not, I'm going to make people feel like they really are my neighbor. And, the average person's relationship with their neighbor could be very negative, right? But Fred's definition of neighbor is like a Jesus-shaped definition, is somebody that you love and welcome. And so I can't remember him even ever really mentioning God on the show. I can't think of it. I can't think of a single time. But the way he lived was by the definitions, I think, of Jesus, at least in terms of who a neighbor is, what are you supposed to do with them. And so he says, come and see. I think Becky already quoted this, but when Mr. Rogers calls Fred on the phone and says, do you know what is the most important thing in the world to me right now? Talking to Lloyd Vogel. It's like, oh. It's like, how often am I distracted when I'm with a neighbor?
Yeah. It's very convicting to even just, we can blame smartphones. We could say it's because of the time that we live in with smartphones and whatnot. But really, there's so many ways that we can be distracted. We can be distracted when we're talking to people, even within our own thoughts, even without having to leave our own minds. But even just an intentional thing is to just not be on your phone with someone, not looking at your smartwatch, whatever the case may be. And yeah, am I really that intentional with people? I mean, it depends on the person. Sometimes if they interest me enough, sure. But what about those that don't interest me? You know what I mean? How am I really being loving to them? I mean, and in terms of the whole question of, the command, loving our neighbor as yourself, Mr. Rogers really seeks to embody that quite well, and perhaps to ask the question, who is my neighbor? One thing that I don't know that it's in our notes, but it's a fascinating point, is that Mr. Rogers seemed to transcend the political lines, as we were talking about earlier. He wasn't, he did a good job staying above the fray of a lot of the kind of divisive cultural issues of his time, but he did dive into at least some of them. And there's a particular moment where there was, and I don't remember the details on this, but there was some sort of segregation related issue related to swimming pools. And he invited a character on the show who was black, who was, I believe, already an established character, to sit on the porch with him and to rest his feet in the pool. Because, they're not going to get in a swimming pool in the studio, but they do something similar and symbolic where the two of them take their shoes off and they rest them in a swimming pool together. And just a simple moment in a slow-paced kind of kids show, but that was really breaking down barriers in its own way and in its own calm and kind way. So you could argue that, yes, he did kind of get into a political issue, a political topic, but he did so in a way that said, you are my neighbor, in a very Good Samaritan type of fashion, which is to bring down the walls that were separating people, the artificial barriers that existed at the time. So I don't know a ton more detail on that particular instance, but I'm curious.
It was very much also like we said earlier. I don't remember if it was before we started recording or not, but how it was a demonstrating, like a showing.
Yeah.
It wasn't like, hey kids, we're all created equal, so don't be racist. He wasn't like that. He was like, here's my friend. I'm already sitting here on this hot day, rinsing, like cooling off my feet. Here's my friend, my neighbor. Why don't you come and join me alongside this thing that I'm doing? And I'm not going to explain to you why this is so important. I'm just going to do it, and you're going to watch me do this. Like, all of you people on TV are going to see this. Like, it's just very, like, here I am living my life, demonstrating things.
Yeah, it's like much more powerful than, for example, in the NFL end zones and on the goalposts, you have these signs that say, like, stop hate, like, written across in the end zone of a football game, and almost everybody I know will just roll their eyes at that and be like, this is not a genuine thing. It's not even really a costly thing for them. It's like, how does this actually do anything? But when Mr. Rogers took off his socks and shoes along with a black man in his show and shared an experience with them, that spoke volumes more than somebody just pointing their finger at you and saying, stop hate, even though he would speak right to you. He was just like, Mr. Rogers was a man of of virtues, and I think this movie showed, at least to me, a lot of his virtues. Like a big one, I think David was already mentioning it, was his integrity. There's this question: okay, are you Fred Rogers at one point, and then Mr. Rogers in another? Do you think you're a hero? Oh no, not at all. Well, how about Mr. Rogers? Is he a hero? And then Mr. Rogers doesn't even answer the question. Instead, he kind of points to Lloyd and he goes, what actually happened in that fight? It's like, you're challenging me about my integrity. And it's almost like Mr. Rogers being like, I know you lied to me. Is this time for the truth yet?
Yeah.
And so his integrity allowed him to kind of launch into a question that broke through the hard heart of Lloyd. Like, Mr. Rogers was a man of integrity. I also thought he was like a man of humility. Like Rick Warren has this famous quote, a very short quote, saying that humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. And I thought Mr. Rogers showed that a couple times in this movie. So, for example, remember the tent scene where he's setting up the tent?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh man,
that was hard to watch, actually. And I to this day, and maybe you guys can clarify for me. Was he supposed to set it up, or was he supposed to fail at setting it up? Like, what was actually meant to be part of that scene? I think he was supposed to just set up the tent, and then that was supposed to be what happened. And instead, he wasn't able to, and he just turned it into a lesson. I mean, do you guys know what was the intended there?
I think you got it right. I think that I'd never seen a tent like that. I think you're supposed to push it down, and it's supposed to kind of just spring into place because of some center thing at the top. But he looks at the dailies and goes, I think that's good. I think it's good for kids to understand that even when adults make plans, they sometimes don't turn out the way they'd hope. And I was like, oh man, he summarized in a moment this little lesson for children that is basically like the essence of what causes the most frustration for adults in this world. Is I made plans and they have been frustrated, and now I'm angry at God, angry at myself, angry at anybody else whose plans succeeded instead of mine. Like, just in this little no, I think that's good to show the kids, and it was complete humility that I can't set up a tent on live TV.
It's just that little thing. There's actually so many bits to it, because then he made the comment, I feel like it was still on when he was still recording it, where it's just like, oh, perhaps this takes two adults to pitch the tent, and that goes with the overall recurring theme of the support and friend and
yeah.
Because right now I'm just thinking about the sign for friend where he's showing the together, and but yeah, it's just so it's just the twofold of my plans didn't go, and also maybe I need a friend, I need a neighbor, I can't do this alone.
I mean, and that really is a biblical concept too, that two are better than one, as Ecclesiastes tells us, for so many reasons. We're not designed to go it alone. And I think it's interesting to sort of tie the last point into this point, that the reason that he was able to do a lot of that kind of show and not tell stuff like he did with the pool, is that he was able to rely on the reputation he had built. It wasn't just, I'm some guy. Like, if I just went on public access TV and, if I was alive back in the 60s, if I had just gone on public access TV and just waved at the camera and then put my feet in the pool and had a black friend come and put their feet in the pool, that wouldn't have meant anything, because I wouldn't have had any established integrity with the people that were viewing me. I wouldn't have had the reputation that he had. But the fact is that he was able to do things knowing people respect me, and I have a responsibility because of that. That, I think, is incredibly huge and important, that he's able to say and acknowledge, okay, and to take that seriously. One of the passages, and I'm doing this from memory, which is a bad idea, but if one of you leads the little children astray, it's better that you have a millstone hung around your neck and that you're drowned in the depths of the sea. That's the type of passage that I think everyone in children's ministry should memorize, and should, probably have a poster of it somewhere around, because it's like, you have an incredible responsibility. Yeah, you think you're just doing Sunday school. You think you're just working with kids, but really you are responsible for helping shape them. And Mr. Rogers seemed to understand that and to take that seriously. He had that established credibility, and so he knew he could do certain things with it. But he probably also had to exercise a lot of responsibility and say, you know what, this is a particular thing I'm passionate about, but I'm not going to go there in this episode. I'm sure that there was a lot of behind the scenes choices of what not to get into, which I'd be fascinated to know more about. Yeah.
He says something like, fame is just another 4-letter word, like face or Zoom. Yeah. What matters is what you do with it, I think he says, which is a similar to what he says in his song, what do you do with the mad that you feel? It's like, it's okay to feel the feelings that you have. What is important is what you do with them, and he's, it's just so interesting the way he wielded this incredible power of fame in order to help the world one child at a time, the way he saw it.
Yeah.
It reminded me of, a theme verse for this movie for me was how this movie explained to me when Jesus says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect in Matthew 5. So in Matthew 5, Jesus is talking about love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, be like your Father in heaven who sends the sun and the rain on the just and the unjust alike, just like indiscriminately loving people. And so some people will see be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect as like you must be morally perfect like Jesus, which none of us can achieve. But Jesus is really just saying, like, be indiscriminately loving to other people. Take a genuine interest in other people. Like with all the power you have, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And I think that Mr. Rogers is the best example I've ever seen of a follower of Jesus. At least, I don't even know exactly what his specific beliefs were. I think he was trained to be like a Presbyterian minister at one point, who
I think he was
tried
a Sunday
to love
school
people.
teacher, at least. Yeah.
But he just had this idea of like, I'm going to treat everyone as if they're precious. He wasn't blind to the world. He wasn't deluded, but he was nearly perfect in his just indiscriminate love, unconditional love to the people that he approached on the street. Like, he was interviewed on Arsenio Hall, at the time that was supposed to be, like this down to earth, like real talk kind of show. And, Arsenio asked him, like, there's a lot of bad stuff going on out there, things going on. What do we need to do? And Fred responds to him, there are no simple answers, of course, but if we could, through television programs, as well as every other imaginable program, let people know that each one of us is precious. Like that summarizes his mission.
Yeah. Oh, that's so special. I mean, you're right that he made his life go. I mean, and there's sort of like even kind of like a secular takeaway from that of like, how to be successful. Somebody could write a BS book about it, and it's like, make a goal and stick with it kind of thing. And this would be a really good example of that kind of advice, is that he was singular in his focus. He had his face set like a flint, if you will, towards what he was concerned about. And it wasn't everything. And it wasn't trying to be a man who saved the world. He was trying to be a good steward of what he had, which was the minds and the hearts of children. And those children became adults, and he influenced generations, multiple generations. We looked it up earlier. The show was on the air for 30 years, a 3-year break in there, but 30 total years. To imagine a 30-year career on television, that is insane. Very few people have accomplished something like that. And to be such a household name and to be so widely admired, he's an example of somebody that, there's sort of a couple elements to that. Is that I loved the discussion that he was not perfect, despite the fact that he was, you know what, I'm gonna hold off on that point because we'll get to that in a moment. It looks like in the notes, but
yep, we're almost there.
I was like, I should scroll through because I clearly didn't really read these. I'm sorry.
We're
I'm
still
going to
talking
stop
about
talking.
I like this this point of it's interesting to wrestle with his indiscriminate acceptance of people. That's actually where I thought there was some good. I've always wrestled with Mr. Rogers' blanket acceptance of people. You know, he says in the show, I don't think anybody can grow unless he's really accepted exactly as he is. And he has this vision of accepting children for who they are, not just for what they could be and what they are expected to be. And I was like, well, he is pointing out a negative, that it's strange it's difficult to be a child when everybody is just excited about how you will change and not be who you are, right? And that's a burden, and it's isolating, and it's kind of harmful, you know. But in this movie, Lloyd labels himself a broken person, and Mr. Rogers basically says, no, you're not a broken person, you know. And that's one thing I wrestle with. It's like I so deeply admire the way Mr. Rogers approached people, but there seems to be this part where it's like, I don't know exactly what to do with this blanket acceptance of people, because I don't think people should accept me just the way I am, because there's plenty of things in me that are bad.
well, hold on. Let's perhaps redeem that one, because there's two different ways that you could look at those terms and like what you're talking about, right? So like, you know, on the one hand, there is that like we are all broken, we live in a broken world and we're all broken, but there's and that's in comparison when you take like us versus like God and you know, the ideal and perfection and like glorification. When you compare us to that, but when you compare us to each other, and when you look at it from our point of view, then that does hold there, in that there's a, I don't know, that one hit me so hard, because I don't remember like really thinking about it much the first time, but like this time I did, because there's like the past couple of years has been like a lot about just different things, and then learning that that I have ADHD and autism, and so reading more things about, or seeing more things about people that also have that, and they talk about having been a like gifted child, and people talk about how much potential you have, and you're gonna do this and that, and so when you don't, and so this still would also apply to anyone, but like when you have these things of like, oh, you're so smart, you're gonna do this, oh, you're so creative, you're gonna do this, and when you don't meet those potentials, it's just kind of like, well, like I failed, like what have I done? What do I offer to this world? You know, like when you look at it from that point of view, it's like, well, of course, it's like, yeah, on one it's like, no, you're not broken. So on one hand, it's like, yes, of course you're broken, because we're all broken. But then it's like, no, you're not broken, because like, you know, God made you this way. And yes, he doesn't, they mention praying and mention the Bible, but they don't mention a lot. But also, neither does blanking on that one book of the Bible that doesn't mention God, right? So like it's
Esther.
Like, so yeah, so they don't mention, you know, right? So it's like yes, you are broken, but also you're not, because this is the way God made you, and you're gonna do like, and so it is an accepting of where people are, and he's saying that's how they need to be able to grow. So it's also not saying you're gonna stay there, but in order to accept someone where they are, in order for them to grow, because he's not saying, and then they're just stay right there because that's good enough. Because he's not saying like, oh yeah, Lloyd, you're perfect the way you are. He's like, no, you're messed up, and I'm not going to tell you that, because like also you're not messed up. It's a both and.
Yeah,
I agree. That's a really good distinction to make, and good use of the receive, reject, redeem paradigm there. Because, you know, I think a good way to put it might be that, are you broken? Maybe, but you're not a mistake. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but like, you know, the idea of brokenness, because ultimately there are two elements to our nature. There are two elements to creation, which is that it was created very good and that it's fallen. And so we bear the image of God. We as humans bear God's image, and therefore we are like him in some ways. But at the same time, we are also fallen sinners. And so and not just fallen sinners, but we live in a fallen world such that, could a person who has, a particular, progressive genetic disorder or something like that say, am I broken? Well, you're not a mistake. As far as broken, unfortunately, there's an element of you that is not the very good creation that was designed. But at the very same time, you are what God has made you in this moment. And so it's a very tricky thing to answer, because it's like in the big picture sense of, am I broken? I mean, the whole world is messed up, and we all have those elements of that. But at the same time, God has created all of these things and works and uses them for his good. And so, have I made mistakes in my life? Have I done things that I'm not proud of course, but are those things that the Lord uses and redeems? It's just like redeeming that point. He redeems all of us. And so I think that's a very important element of that distinction, is that you're not worthless. You're not a mistake. You're not only good for the potential things that you could become. No one gets to define who you are but God and but Christ. And so we don't find our identity in what society says that we are. We don't find our identity in what our expectations are for ourselves. We only find our identity in who Christ says that we are. And the minute we forget that, it's easy to fall into a feeling of worthlessness.
It's just, Becky said something that I really liked about that. It's a really good starting point, right? Like this is how you reach somebody, is by actually recognizing the value that God has placed inside them. Like this, it reminded me of Luke 15, where you have the lost sheep, the lost coin, and then the prodigal son, the lost son. Where it's like the sinners, the people that we would say are broken or lost. God finds you valuable, and I'm going to show you that, because it's something that it's something that you've lost. I saw Fred Rogers' ministry, for lack of a better way to put it, as a possible rebuke of, like, sometimes young men in particular, they discover theology, like accurate theology, and they just go around being like, we're all sinners, you're all so wicked, you're all going to hell, I don't deserve anything, you don't deserve anything. And that knowledge, I think, puffs up, right? Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies, kind of thing, is that, like, there's an accuracy to what you're saying, but also you're missing something. And it seems like Fred found a way to really embody the aspect of the Christian worldview that sees people as valuable. But it seems like if you have only that, like a lot of this times he was calling kids to grow. Even I think it's the feeling of, what do you do with the mad that you feel? It's like someday boys will become a man, and girl will become a woman. Like, the mad that you feel is a real thing, and it's okay to feel the feelings that you feel. It's what you do with those feelings that matters. It's like, okay, yeah. So you're letting it be okay that I feel the things that I feel, which allows me to actually have an honest conversation about what to do with those feelings. I think in the face of death in this movie, he says anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable is manageable. It's like so much time, because of the expectations that people put on us, we aren't even going to mention anything. We just stuff it down, and then we don't manage it. We just stuff it, and then it explodes, and we end up having a fight at our sister's wedding.
and it's like, and that is like never what we're told to do. And yeah, we see that all the time in the church too, because like it's such a thing of like, you can't, and I feel like sometimes I feel like this is being talked about more and it's getting better, but it's like so much time, like people think like, oh yeah, I can't show weakness, I can't show any of this and that, like I have to go and put on a perfect face to go, and then church clothes, like people are gonna like then not go because like, well, I can't right now because I'm not good enough. And it's just like, hold on, I think you actually need to go, because you need to to find out that that's the point.
I attended for a while a very popular church whose vision is to be real with themselves, God, and others. And the pastor grew up going to a church where he had to dress in the nice church clothes, And then he named the church Sandals because he had some issues with his feet that were it was just ugly. And he's like, I always wore shoes instead of sandals because I didn't want people to see my real feet. And he's like, I want a place where people can actually reveal the ugly inside and be accepted. And so this vision to be real has been a very valuable thing. And I think especially in a pre-churched culture, people who have already been going to church, that there's a real issue with that. Things just being stuffed down.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because to hear that, it sounds very similar to a current cultural buzzword of being authentic. #authentic, right?
Yeah.
That I can be a total jerk. I'm trying not to even use swearing adjacent words on this episode. The spirit of Fred Rogers is
scandalous.
Yeah, you can be. I can be a total.
Yeah, I don't even know
jerk
how he
to
would
someone.
put that. How would Fred Rogers say I'm
Wait,
being a jerk?
that's too
Right?
crass.
Wouldn't say poo poo. I don't know how.
Not very nice. Yeah.
A really mean person.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess
And
Or,
so,
would even be a mean person, or to be like a scared person who is lashing out because they're scared, and so they're turning that scared into anger.
Yeah.
He would probably put it very well. However he did.
Yeah. What would
But,
I do with the mad that I feel? It's that's the thing is I've been trying for a decade and a half to grow to be the loving person that following Jesus will create me to be, right? And I'm still the distance between me and Fred Rogers is so it's so big. I can't even think about how he would respond to some of the things I regularly say, how he would translate them. It's like that was one big issue in this movie is or anybody who even knew Fred Rogers, everybody was challenged by his way of being, he's being interviewed by Oprah and she says I know you're a father of 2 boys, but I can't imagine you ever having a problem with your children. Have you ever had any? And then Mr. Rogers says, well, of course, I'm human just like everybody else. But that was the challenge in this movie is it even possible to be like Fred Rogers? But the movie revealed he had 2 boys. One was even ashamed to mention that his dad was Mr. Rogers. And the other, he said, genuinely tested him, which I don't know what that means, but it sounds like very euphemistic,
It sounds like that one was the second child. Actually, he did say that. He said that was the second child. So it sounds like standard second child lingo to me.
Yeah.
He was a testing one.
Yeah.
Not
but
to
then
knock
he
either
says,
of you if you're second children.
but we've worked through it, something like that, and I'm very proud of both of them. He talked a lot about being proud of people. I bet so-and-so would be very proud of the journalist you are. So-and-so would be very proud of the way you color or, all those things.
Yeah.
And, like holy pride as opposed to kind of unholy conceit that he would actually build up in people. Like it's to be proud of who you are and the image bearer that you are, the person that you are. He just challenges me. Like Lloyd talks, he's talking to Joanne Rogers, and they have this exchange that was my favorite in the movie. He says, so what does it feel like being married to a living saint? And Joanne goes, I'm not fond of that term. If you think of him as a saint, then his way of being is unattainable. He works at it all the time. It's patience. He's not a perfect person. He's got a temper. He chooses how he responds to that anger. And then Lloyd says, well, that must take a lot of effort. And she talks about his method. Well, yeah, he does things every day that help ground him. Reads scripture, swims laps, prays for people by name, writes letters, hundreds of them. He's been doing that since I met him. And I like that she basically made a very strong argument for spiritual disciplines. This is one of the most positive portrayals of a Christian spiritual discipline I've ever seen in a movie. Usually if somebody quotes scripture or reading scripture, they're about to judge somebody and be a hypocrite in a movie. They're about to be the villain but she's saying, look, here's how you create Fred Rogers. Read scripture, get some exercise, pray for people by name, write letters, connect with people, and do it regularly. Like, oh man, that's a great prescription for how to become a little bit more like Fred Rogers. And the argument that the movie is effectively making is that his way is possible. It's not unattainable. You could actually follow Fred Rogers. It was encouraging and challenging all at the same time.
For sure.
Yeah, that's a point with he said, like, then that would be, or that she said that would be unobtainable, because then that could be taken as a, like, well, that's for him because his specials, like, I can't do that because I wasn't selected to be this special person. That's a different.
Yeah. And so she's, like Joanne Rogers is kind of like, I've been seeing this in people, that people are using excuses to not be like him. It was almost, she was very nice when she said it, but I'm not fond of that term. Was much sharper than you might expect Mr. Rogers to say, but it was, it's almost like turning to the camera and being like, you guys are going to use this as an excuse not to be challenged by his example. That's a great point, Becky.
Yeah, it makes you think about, like, well, this what we've been, like, kind of talking about the whole time, but, like, the something that Dave put in the comments earlier, follow me as I follow Mr. Rogers, who follows Christ, right?
Yeah.
It's like, look at this, and you can too. Like,
exactly. What's fascinating? The habits that he built, because there's a little note, and I'm sorry I haven't been very engaged in the last minute because I've been looking things up. She says he's been doing that since I met him. I thought that was interesting. He's writing letters. My thought is, that's fan mail. He's responding to fan mail. Okay, that's cool. But I was like, wait a second. Did she meet him after the show started? So I looked it up. No, they got married in 1952. He was 40 years old when the show started, 68. So that means that he was, and so I'm reading very briefly. He had an earlier career in public television before he started his own show. And so he was doing the same kind of thing for a while before he was famous for it in terms of his own show that was named after him. Makes sense. You don't usually start headlining your own thing, but I don't know. I just think that's interesting that before he would probably have been a big enough deal to get a lot of fan mail, he was writing letters. I wonder what she meant by that. If that could have meant that he was seeking people out rather than simply responding when people sought him out. I don't really know where to go with that thought. It's just something that's occurring to me that he developed those habits early on, that if he's been doing that since she met him in the 50s, and this is set in the late 90s, I think, or mid to late 90s, that there must have been a tremendous amount of dedication and that's involved with that element of his routine. I like that they mentioned that he reads scripture, of course, Popcorn Theology. I was glad that got put
great.
in there. Albeit that there wasn't much more than that. That's still something. It could easily have been completely sanitized from his life, the way that the movie Unbroken was. Just completely removed the Christian elements entirely.
Yeah.
But it was a really good illustration. I liked that it was mentioned that he struggled, that he has a temper. As somebody who has a temper, I was very comforted to know for the first time in my life that Mr. Rogers actually was human, because in a lot of ways, like he really strikes me as Superman. We like our heroes, and I forget, somebody in the Facebook group was mentioning the Batman versus Superman sort of dichotomy of anti-hero versus unattainable role model. That I'm reminded of the line from Kal-El, that you'll give humanity a goal to strive for. They will fall, but ultimately one day they will join you in the sun. This lovely notion, but I feel like almost Mr. Rogers is a good example of that. And it's so humbling to think that, Paul described all of his righteous works. In many ways, Paul was a bit of a Mr. Rogers himself, in terms of, he was by at least Pharisee standards, by Jewish standards, he was top notch. He was doing everything right. And, he said, I count all of that as nothing. I count all of that as filthy rags. That's all rubbish. My righteousness is as filthy rags before the Lord. Hopefully I'm not butchering these paraphrases too badly, but the notion here is you could easily look at this, and Mr. Rogers, if pressed, I could see him saying something like this, that yes, I know that I've inspired millions of children, and that I've helped them deal with their feelings in a positive way. I've accomplished my mission, but ultimately all of that is rubbish compared to knowing Christ. And all of that is filthy rags. All of that righteousness is filthy rags before the Lord, because ultimately even Fred Rogers is a sinner who's in need of, he's gone on to be, hopefully with Jesus now, as far as we can tell, that he is somebody who needed the saving grace of Christ, and that even as good as he was never somebody who could have earned his salvation. Like, that to me is so humbling, that even if you could look at him and say, oh, what if I did that? What if I brute force lived a moral life without Christ? Doesn't matter. It's still nothing. Like, that to me is super humbling.
Well, and it's also, that just made me think about how, like, it's not like he just read his Bible and he, like, just did this and that. Like, he's there, like, also, I know, practicing it. And it made me think about that one quote that is, like, often can be very controversial, but, like, it's because it's like living the gospel without words.
Oh yeah, preach the gospel, but if necessary, use words
if necessary.
It's attributed to Francis of Assisi, I think.
Yeah, and so, like, sometimes, like, people get really upset about that, and there's this, and, it wasn't a lot about, like, God or Christianity talked about in the movie, but the thing is, it's also that it goes back to another thing about, like, there's not just one person, like, it's one piece, right? So, like, for praying, and it, like, is he, could be praying for, like, a specific thing, like, but, like, help them with this thing, but it also could be about, praying that they find that next step, because also with the letters thing, like, it's just that what he is doing is not necessarily it's about being a celebrity or being with the fans. It's just people. And so he happens to interact with a lot of people. So he cannot be there as, like, the pastor or something for all these tens of thousands of people that he comes into contact with. It's one step. And another step is someone else is hopefully going to be there alongside them to talk about, more, like, go through other things more with them, but it's just kind of like just knowing that you're one piece of it. And that's also goes back to a whole of, like, it's not just him that's the only one that can do things. Or trying to say, like, oh yeah, I'm gonna leave this to the people who are the saints or something.
Yeah, and his philosophy was, I am looking into the camera and I'm trying to connect with one child. Right? I'm just, and that's kind of like probably the way you would stay sane, trying to do what Mr. Rogers had done. Is I am just going to love people one person at a time. And if you multiplied your ministry like that, you would be able to reach everyone. Right? It would be like when Jesus is feeding the 5,000 and he's splitting the bread, and the disciples come back basket by basket to collect from Jesus to give to everybody. They can't feed everybody, but if you come to Jesus and you take the basket that you've got and you deliver as much bread as you can carry from Jesus to the people around you, and everybody does that, then like you flip the world right side up. The kingdom of God is brought in and among you by the power of Jesus, then you could be able to shoulder the burden that Jesus has given you, as opposed to looking at the entire world of people, the sheep without shepherds, and feeling responsible for all of them all at once. Like, just love God and love others maximally, the people in front of you, and keep on moving and practicing your spiritual disciplines. And Fred Rogers was just one man who seemed to do it, to be perfect as his heavenly Father is perfect, in that one sense of trying to make children or anybody he's interacted with feel precious. But one part of this movie I liked, I think we were discussing this several weeks ago, Becky was bringing up one of her favorite points of this movie was just, they did in a kind of way highlight the burden that Mr. Rogers was carrying in this movie. That people will just come to him with their problems. And Lloyd does seem to kind of crack his shell a little bit in order to get him to talk about his burdens, like with his sons and with the mad that he feels, right?
Right. I mean, yeah, he's basically, it seems like he's trying to get it out of him. Like, all right, so come on, like you must have gotten mad at your kid. He's trying to get some humanity out of him for his story, kind of thing. It seems like you're trying to at least understand, comparing him to his own father. Like, how are you so different from my dad? And how is it that you're both fathers? Like, what, he's trying to just get his head around it, and he doesn't get much out of him. He just says, they tried me, but thank you for your perspective. Yes, that was difficult, but thank you.
There was a couple times where he thanked him, where like I felt like, Lord, just like why are you like why'd you turn it around like this? Because like he kept pushing on it. So it's like one thing where he was just like, doesn't that get to you? And he was just like telling him about the different things he would do with this, and he was just like, I like to bang on the piano, and he was just like, okay, but like, doesn't that get burdensome or whatever? Like,
Yeah, I think.
Don't people wear you out? And he's just like, boom, like he just says, he's just on it more. And it's like he's explaining, like, and every time it feels like he's deflecting, it's like he's like explaining. So when he talks about his puppets, when he's talking about the piano, he's answering his questions.
Yes.
But he doesn't, like, Lloyd's not picking up on that right away. But yeah, I also like where he's like, and then he's like, thank you for your compassion, like saying when like it sounds like Lloyd's almost trying to like put down all the people, like, oh yeah, aren't they bothering you? It's like, thank you for your compassion.
Yeah.
For like asking this.
Thank you for that perspective, that super challenging perspective about probably the most painful aspect of my life, that I can help millions of children through TV, but my sons have a really hard time with this. Thank you for that perspective. It must have been really hard on my children. You're like, oh, what a gracious way to respond. But in some ways, it didn't feel fake. Do you ever talk to anybody about the burdens you carry? And then Mr. Rogers just mimes the bong, and then at the end of the movie, like the final shot is so great. It's just piano. Mr. Rogers sitting down at the piano. All the production people are leaving, and then it's just him, and he plays a nice little tune. Everybody's gone, and then he goes bong on the piano, and then lets that resonate for a little while, and then moves into a nice tune, and that's the end of the movie as it fades out. You're like, there's just this this picture that Mr. Rogers was human, and he did actually feel the weight and the sting of, as Galatians would say, bearing one another's burdens.
Yeah, and in thanking him, I think that's a good illustration of, especially in Lloyd's facial reaction, his response. He's like, yeah, no problem. Like, it's an example of, being, loving your enemies, and in so doing, you will heap hot coals upon their head. Like, the goal isn't to heap hot coals on their head, but they're going to be so thrown off their rhythm by your kindness, because we're so not used to that. That was a good illustration of it.
It's almost an illustration of how many times in Scripture we are called to rejoice in suffering, or, Philippians 4, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, with prayer and thanksgiving, I think, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, that we talk about, that will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Right? It's like thanksgiving in the midst of things that make you feel anxious, and he's willing to. I think in one way, he's refusing to retaliate against a challenging question. He's like not totally dodging the question, but he's refusing to take revenge. Man, it's just great.
Yeah, it's making me think about like two different things right now. So it's just like, I don't know which way to talk about it. So it's like, one way, because it's like, it's not dodging, because I feel like, because there's always, the thing is always like the authenticity and integrity and everything, and like, so the one thing it's making me think about is, just the reframing, and also like, what are you going to do with that? Like, what are his options? So it's similar to like, what are you going to do with the mad? So it's just like, what are my options with how I can respond to this question? And so how I can do it is be like, oh, that's an interesting perspective, which is also a de-escalation technique that they talk about in de-escalation training, right? And stuff like, if someone's talking about it, it's like, okay, you're acknowledging, like, I don't know, like, so it's a reframing is part of the thing. And the other thing is, it made me think about, which also is something earlier, and I don't remember exactly. It was one of the questions that Lloyd had, and that it was making me think about it again, is that, like, when the Pharisees kept coming to Jesus, and it was with the facing. So like when the Pharisees keep coming to Jesus and asking this and that, and then he'll ask them a different question, and it's not like he's being dodgy. It's just like, well, hey, let's just cut to like
the real issue. Yeah,
I had thought the same thing. Is that when Jesus is asked questions, so often he doesn't answer them directly, and that must have been infuriating. But the people were trying to trap him, and Jesus knew that. He had the benefit of knowing their heart in the matter. And in a kind of, a bit of an image of that in this movie is that Fred Rogers knows the MO of this Lloyd guy. He knows that he's trying to find dirt on him and that he's playing chess with him in a way, kind of, but not because he necessarily has something to hide, but because he knows that this guy's motives are like this. And he does seem to be interested in trying to figure him out, which is why he does the whole puppet thing and whatnot. He's trying to understand him, but it's not just, oh, I want to understand you so I can take you down and protect myself. It's, you seem hurt and broken. What happened? And how can I, what can be done to help that? And you're right. He answers questions with questions, which seems like a really bad idea, but really it's the way that Jesus answered questions, is that you make points. I mean, it's a teaching technique as well, not just oh, here's an easy answer to a question. It's, oh, you asked a good question. Thank you for that. And then to answer it by showing. And so you're right. I think that he images Christ in a lot of ways, and the way he responds to criticism is a big one.
Wow, this is interesting. In our chat, Dave Mattingly's talking about how in their Easter pageant, when the Pharisees are questioning Jesus, they stop and have the kids say, "That's a trick question," right? It was like turning to the screen.
Yeah. I don't know if I don't know. I guess I feel like it's. Hopefully, I'm not backing up too much. But earlier, you said something about the Facebook group, and I think you're probably referring to Rory Thomas's thing where he was talking about in our cynical age, where ours are preferring like dark heroes.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, can Boy Scouts an insult, and like, okay, can Mr. Rogers really be that nice? If you look hard enough, we want the dirt. And so it's kind of like with those also the things like Mr. Rogers was never trying to say, oh yeah, they're not burdening me, I don't get exasperated, I don't this and that, but it's just not the point.
Yeah, what is he doing with the mad that he feels, right?
Yeah. And it's kind of like, it's going to be like, yes, but we're not going to dwell on that because the point isn't, it's like no, only God is perfect. Like, only God is good, only Jesus is perfect. So it's like, but we're not going to dwell on like talking, like tearing down someone and focusing on that. And so he's also not focusing on other people either.
Yeah, it's just amazing. It's just amazing to me. Like right now, I have a 2-year-old kid, and he will ask me if I want to watch Batman fight bad guys or if I want to watch Mr. Rogers, because these are like two of the influences I let even into our home, and I feel like a little guilty even having exposed my kid to Batman, even the animated series, which is so great, where he offers mercy to bad guys at the end of every episode. But it's like I want me to be like Mr. Rogers, not like Batman, because Batman is such a fallen character, right? What does he do with the mad that he feels? He embraces it and turns it back on those who prey on the fearful. Mr. Rogers, he finds constructive ways and brings
bangs on the piano instead, yeah,
and love into the world. And those, like, these two figures are some of the characters, even though Mr. Rogers is a person, not just a character, that I admire most. And they're basically opposites in what they do with the mad that they feel.
No, that's a good that's a good illustration. I think that even the notion of like trying to find the dirt on him, that was brought up a little bit in the movie. Obviously, that's the main plot, but also in where the brother-in-law asks something like, "Oh, so you were in the Navy SEALs or whatever, right?" Like, he asks him that question about your military service. Have you guys heard that that
Oh,
kind
yeah.
of meme that was going around.
That the reason he
That
wears
got
sweaters
a
all the
lot
time
of
is to
traction.
cover military
His full
tattoos.
sleeve tattoos, which is kind of crazy because I think full sleeve tattoos are a much more recent development. Like a 1940s veteran, 1960s veteran wouldn't have had sleeves. My grandfather was a double veteran in terms of served in 2 branches of the military, and he had a lot of tattoos, but never sleeves. Not that many tattoos. But no, that was just completely fictional, completely made up. But I think that took hold in people's minds for an interesting reason, that we wanted to have this notion that, what are you running from, Mr. Rogers? What are you atoning for? You're good now. Okay. But like, what's in your past that you're running from, or that you're trying to make up for? And maybe there is, certainly there's something. Certainly he was a sinner. There had to be some dirt, but I'm glad that the movie didn't really give us that, because that's not the point. That's not the point of the movie. And ultimately we can have a character who is just striving for virtue, not because he, accidentally killed some people when he was younger by hitting them with a car or something like that. Like many movies, if you were to go that route, it would be, I'm atoning for this particular thing that I did. It's something much more, much more fascinating than that, which is just that he had a mission, and ultimately his faith played an enormous role in that. And the movie kind of doesn't get into that, sadly. But as a result, we see Jesus in Mr. Rogers, and that's what everyone is drawn to about him. It's not because he is just a really good human, really good guy. Yeah, it's because there's something in our hearts that longs for that. There's a Mr. Rogers shaped hole in all of us. And that's because he so closely mirrors the God-shaped hole, because that's what he let us see.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary of how Mr. Rogers has challenged our entire culture. And it's really nice to see a movie that actually says that this was inspired by scripture and prayer. It's pretty wonderful. Like, Mr. Rogers he is a hero. He's a real hero, but his virtues are Christian virtues. Integrity. He's the same in public as in private. He's humble, right? He admits his mistakes, but he doesn't dwell on them. He focuses, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. So he focuses on other people, right? He's great. And at the end of this Mr. Rogers episode, Lloyd Vogel ends up actually being able to embrace forgiveness because of his exposure to a disciple of Jesus who tries to love people. It's just wonderful. I've been so challenged in the best way by this movie. Yeah. I love it.
Yeah. But one thing on the atonement thing and then like the dirt is that and it's something like they're not going to necessarily say, but like you don't need to have this like huge scandalous thing to atone for.
Right.
Because like that's gonna suggest that like, oh yeah, like if you've whatever the example you said of like, oh, like killing people, accidentally killing people when you're younger or this and that. It's like, how about like all of us already there. You don't need to have this dramatic thing on top of it to say like this is why he had to do this. And it's just like, how about he was a sinner saved by grace and he was forgiven, and now he's going to go and show the love to other people.
Exactly. Now now that you've been saved, you go. Exactly. Those who have been forgiven much. I mean, and it almost seems like that sort of trend or that storyline almost in a way justifies the earlier sin as like, oh, everything happens for a reason. And the reason that you did this horrible thing is so that you could learn from it. And you're right that it really focuses so much more on the fact that Mr. Rogers, I mean, yeah, he was seeking to do something, but it wasn't to atone for something huge and horrible that he did. It was seeking to be who God created him to be. And so, and, it's fascinating that, I haven't brought him up this whole time, but Elwood P. Dowd, right? Harvey. So we did an episode on Harvey.
Yeah.
And I see a ton of similarities between Harvey and Mr. Rogers in terms of the virtue, the sort of simple nature, not that, they're stupid, but just this sort of simplistic life. You can go listen to our episode on Harvey for more on that, but there seems to be a ton of parallels between who Mr. Rogers actually was as a person and who Elwood was written to be. And so, yeah, I think that, we should probably start wrapping up, but this has been a fantastic episode. A lot more depth to this than I thought. I was kind of like, it's going to be like cake, there's no conflict, right? How could there be conflict in this story? It's about Mr. Rogers. No, it was excellent. So I appreciate you guys dragging us kicking and screaming, dragging me at least kicking and screaming into this movie. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I got a thirst for that conflict, right? But I wanted to say real quick though, like also you mentioned right now, like, oh, something happened for a reason. He said something like there was something like that in there though, right? Like he was telling, Mr. Rogers was telling Lloyd about how like the stuff, like even with the stuff with his dad, like something about like basically saying how trials shape you, right?
Yeah.
Like,
I can't pull the
like,
quote.
It's shaped who you are as a person.
Yeah.
Because it was somewhere when, after he was saying, because he was like, oh, you like people like me. He's like, I've never met anyone like you. And he's like, well, yeah, me, like broken people. He's just like, no, like, you're not broken, but like, everything shaped you, who you are. And I don't know. So they also went there, but also he's not dwelling on it. And so, but yeah, it's interesting how like the overall the movie was like Lloyd set out to go look for dirt, and instead Mr. Rogers pulled out a sponge and Lloyd cleaned his own dirt.
It's beautiful.
Wow. Love it. Well, that's excellent. And so I think it's interesting too. One thing that he mentions in this movie is his passion for using, and it's mostly in the video clips that Lloyd is watching to prepare, but he talks about the importance of the medium of television. We can use television to do this. And what a beautiful reaction to television to have from, especially a man of his age in the 70s, 80s, 90s, to view television as such a powerful medium for good, rather than simply as a implement or as a tool for the denigration and the down, the destruction of society as we know it. That certainly would have been a very popular notion, certainly at that time and even to this day. And so I think that it's a beautiful parallel to what we do on Popcorn Theology, because our goal is not to necessarily point out all the ways that Hollywood is dropping the ball, but to actually dig and mine for gold and mine for the ways that, look at this, even these stories from, Disney and this company that has problems and there's issues in their worldview, but look how they can't avoid finding and pointing to these elements of scripture. We find biblical worldview elements in everything. It's all over the place. And if you just have to know how to look for it, in the same way that Mr. Rogers is digging for that in the people that he meets, I think that we can find that in the stories that we interact with and that we engage with. And so I want to encourage you guys that are listening to keep doing that. And so thank you guys for making me watch this movie. Becky, thank you for joining us. Thanks for your first time on this episode, on the show. And so looking forward to more interaction like that. And so I want to encourage you guys that are listening to, do the things we talked about earlier. Consider sharing this episode, rating and reviewing, joining our community through social media, and consider supporting us on Patreon. And
subscribe on YouTube.
Most
and
of
all the videos.
YouTube, also YouTube. Yes, YouTube.
I think
I got to get that one in there too.
It's even easier than like various stars. Just thumbs up it, and that will already do so much for the algorithms. Probably just watch it.
Yes.
Also.
Please help us get the YouTube thing off the ground. That's helpful for sure. Subscribe, slam that notification bell, all that fun stuff we can say.
Ring
now.
the bell. I don't know, what do all the kids say?
Well, yeah, I don't know. There's something about that.
If you've made it this far,
we'll
maybe you're in. Yeah.
There you go. And yeah, keep the discussions going, talking about Mr. Rogers and talking about discipleship and all of that stuff, and keep engaging media from a godly worldview. And remember, you are not a mindless consumer.
It's such a good feeling, a very good feeling, the feeling that I'll be back when the day is new, and I'll have more ideas for you, and you'll have things you'll want to talk about. I will too.